So we just heard this passage just a little while ago in our Sunday readings. And if you remember, this parable, which this is the explanation of it, was about someone who sowed good seed. An enemy came and put weeds in there. And then as they were growing up, both the weeds had this ability of wrapping themselves around the wheat, so that if you tried to pull it up, you'd actually be killing several wheat plants at the same time. But also this mystery too of, as it grows up, when they're in their immature state, they look exactly the same. And so if you reach trying to kill one of the weeds, you actually might be killing one of the wheats, because ultimately this is a parable. It's a parable of judgment, but it's a parable of mercy at the same time, of saying God's not finished with any of us. And any of us could either, as they grow, start forming themselves into a weed, even if they look like weed at the beginning, or they're forming themselves maybe looking like weed, but then they form themselves more and more through God's mercy to ultimately become wheat in the end. So it's important for us to remember that the way that the Lord looks at us is He always sees that possibility of conversion. And we need to do the same for others, that no one's outside of God's mercy. But I want to talk about this aspect too of the way in which you try to pull out a weed, and you might be killing 5 wheat plants at the same time. Cardinal Sarah, in the Magnificat meditations, Cardinal Sarah had a very beautiful thing where he said that when we're faced with injustice, when we're faced with evil in the world, sometimes we forget the truth that God is still with us in those situations. God's not causing it, He's not wanting that, but God is still present. And sometimes we try to take things into our own hands to confront injustice, but we do it without looking to Him first. That's what Jeremiah, looking at the injustice that's happening, but he says at the very end, he says, "Is it not you alone, O Lord our God, to whom we look? You alone have done all these things." Jeremiah has the right point of view. Even though he's in the midst of seeing his whole society being destroyed, he first looks at God. Many times we forget to look at God first. And so Cardinal Sarah talks about one of the most important things that we can do, and something that keeps us from exasperating the situation more, is by making sure that we're rooted in that primacy of prayer. We have this sort of like, I want to do. We first have to be before we do. Because if we act without being rooted in our identity, in our relationship with God, then we're going to, in a sense, try to destroy one evil and then usher in a second evil. So this is actually something that George Orwell wrote, 1984, who wrote Animal Farm. He had, I don't know if I'll get the quote exactly right, but he was talking about Animal Farm. And Animal Farm actually is this whole metaphor of what was going on in Russia with the czars. And the czars, they were oppressing the people, and so they revolted, and they kicked out that particular animal, and then they ushered in someone else who turned out to be even worse. And there's this quote of saying, like, be careful with just trying this kind of revolutionary violence, because yes, you might be kicking out an evil, but you might actually be ushering in a far worse evil. And sometimes we, without being rooted in Christ, we might see something that's wrong, and yet we try to destroy it through an evil means. We overcome evil with evil instead of what St. Paul says, overcome evil with good. And you can see in another story this playing out in the character of Boromir in The Lord of the Rings. There's this man, a very proud and mighty man, but he sees that ring of power. If you remember, that ring of power was created by the evil Dark Lord, and no one can use it without being corrupted. But he looks at it, when everyone else is saying that we need to take this and destroy it, he looks at it and he says, it's a gift. Let us use the weapon of the enemy against him. Let me take this ring and I will lead armies against the Dark Lord, and we will finally rid ourselves of the evil. And Gandalf, the wise wizard, says, if you're going to wield that power, you're only just going to become like the Dark Lord. You're going to be corrupted. And I think that's something we have to, when we look at our society, we look at this very reactionary, maybe for, in some aspects, good reasons of saying there is real injustice, but the way that we react against it is not rooted first in love. It's not rooted first in prayer. And it becomes this being swayed by emotions that ultimately leads to rage. And it ends up, in a sense, eating the very people that are setting out to do something that's just. Because it's an evil means, they, in a sense, become the very monster that they're setting out to destroy. Again, there's so many different stories that are out there that tell this tale. Another one is Batman Forever. Remember that movie with Val Kilmer? Batman Forever, you have this character Two-Face, played by Tommy Lee Jones. And in that story, Two-Face kills Robin's parents. Robin has revenge on his heart. And Batman actually confronts him saying, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to kill Two-Face. Batman has this very interesting conversation saying, well, let's say you get everything that you want. Let's say that you're able to totally destroy Two-Face, then what? And Batman ultimately helps him to see that if you are going after him just because of the need of revenge and using violence to, in a sense, slake your thirst of the hurt that he caused, then you're never going to be satisfied. And you're going to keep using that violence over and over again. You're going to be seeking out another in the name of justice, ultimately until you become the very monster that you set out to destroy. So there's profound truths in these different stories that we need to always look and say, am I rooted first in prayer? Now, what that doesn't mean is that we sort of live out what's called quietism or pacifism, in which we say, well, I'm just not going to get involved, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to sit and not live out that social teaching of the gospel. We have to have that balance there, but it has to start first with prayer. It has to start first being rooted in the love of God, because then He allows us to see clearly. He allows us to be able to see the situation through that gift of wisdom. Do you remember we talked about that this past weekend? There are these different drives within us that if we don't allow wisdom to guide, then they, in a sense, take over. And they might seem like they're leading in the right direction, but ultimately we become a slave of that. We become a slave of our passions. In this case, a slave of anger, a slave of rage. And we can't actually be just when we're swayed in that sort of way. So let's ask the Lord that we might be able to really hold on to the mercy of God, to grow as wheat, even while surrounded by weeds, knowing that ultimately the Lord is still in the situation, and that we need to be very careful not to take things in our own hands and say, I'm just going to rip out these weeds, because in doing that, without God's love, charity, and truth, we end up actually destroying more wheat than weeds.